This is the story of war in the air, a ruthless one-on-one battle between man and man, machine and machine, and man and death. The most exciting, dangerous and highly skilled form of dueling ever invented. It is also the story of a whole generation of young men of many nationalities, most of them fresh out of school or university, who fought in the skies over England and Europe from September 1939 until the Allied victory in 1945. It is a story of bravery of friends and foes alike, of the many young men who died for what they unequivocally believed in. Those of us then defending England led strange, unnatural lives in a besieged fortress. We were frontline fighter pilots, destroying the enemy day after day and night after night. And yet, when we returned from battle, we tried for a few hours of rest to lead an almost normal, civilized life among the civilian population, often in quiet villages and small towns that had not been affected by the war and where life remained peaceful. Many of us returned to our wives and children in our ancestral home, as I did for extended periods. We drank with the locals in English pubs, sometimes only an hour after a fantastic rescue or risky victory, who would blame us if we often drank too much to take the edge off. Above all, this is a story of a remarkable sense of camaraderie, loyalty and commitment that gave us the confidence and desire to keep fighting until we won. June 25, 1943 was a beautiful day. The invasion of Europe had already been underway for nearly 3 weeks. The Allies had made initial success with their combined efforts, but had not advanced very far because of fierce German resistance, especially in the British and Canadian sections where most of their powerful panzer divisions were concentrated. And Walsh, my new Aussie navigator, and I will remember that day for the rest of our lives. We intended to destroy my 30th enemy airplane, but instead became guests of the Germans for almost a year. In a Mosquito fighter bomber, borrowed from 21 Squadron Commander Duddy Dale. We flew out of Gravesend and landed at West Rainham to refuel before a raid into the enemy's far rear, near the town of Bath on the Baltic coast of Germany. The objective of this free-hunting sortie was to destroy German aircraft in the air or on the ground, and to shoot any vehicles we could spot on the highways or railroads. The success of daylight raids deep into enemy territory was based on surprise. The route was planned in advance to avoid radar, anti-aircraft artillery and enemy airfields, from which we could intercept his single-seat Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulfs 190s. Single Mosquito, despite its excellent characteristics, could not resist the attacking groups of these highly maneuverable fighters. The necessary conditions for a flight such as ours were the presence of cloud cover covering enemy territory and the possibility of approach from the sea. Ground personnel at West Rainham were replenishing our fuel supply and checking the formidable armament mounted in the nose, 4 20mm cannons and 4 7.7mm machine guns. Meanwhile, Don and I went to the office of Air Base Intelligence Officer Buster Reynolds, an old friend of mine who I will talk about later in this book. Buster briefed us on the enemy radar network, anti-aircraft artillery and fighter locations in Denmark and northern Germany. We planned to cross the coast of Jutland, a little north of Esbjerg, where a lighthouse served as a landmark. Then we were to proceed to the next point, about 16 kilometers south of Copenhagen, of course changing course periodically to confuse the enemy, and from there over the Baltic Sea to Bath, in northern Germany. Our venture required flying at extremely low altitude over sea and land, so as not to be detected by the network of German radar and observation posts. It was not the first time I had to fly over Denmark on such a mission, but getting the latest information was imperative if we wanted our raid to be successful. We were most concerned about 2 enemy fighter airfields, at Aalborg, near the northern tip of Jutland, and at Husum, a little south of the German-Danish border. According to some indications, there were several Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs at these bases. If they were put on standby, our flight over Denmark would be hampered. So we slightly changed the flight route to our target and worked out another return route. The weather officer did not guarantee us cloud cover along the route as we wanted. However, we felt there was a chance. Perhaps his uncertainty was a warning to us, but our eagerness swept away any doubts. We did not realize that the unstable weather, coupled with the many mistakes I would manage to make, would cost us our freedom, almost our lives. We had a brisk breakfast in the officers' mess with comrades from 141 Squadron, which I had commanded the year before. Shortly after noon, Don and I climbed up the ladder into our fully loaded airplane, took our seats next to each other, and waved goodbye. A minute later, to the steady roar of the engines, we began our journey to the Danish coast. At 390 campi, I flew the Mosquito at extremely low altitude over the rich green Norfolk countryside. In less than 15 minutes, we crossed the coast near Cromer and dropped to 7.5 meters above the North Sea, our propellers occasionally kicking up a light spray. None of this was bravado. By flying as low as possible, we left the German radars less chance of detecting us. Had we been as fortunate as we had been on previous flights, we could have achieved complete surprise. A flight of this type was very tiring and required complete concentration. A small mistake would have sent us to Neptune. Don was checking his instruments and maps to ensure that we would fly over the enemy coast in the right place. Since we had about 480 kilometers to cross the North Sea, this was no easy task at all. This part of the flight was always the most stressful. Everyone had time to think, too much time. I knew from experience that fear would keep me from gaining confidence until we reached enemy territory. That was always the case. My anxieties vanished as soon as we were over the enemy's coast. The engine sounded melodious, and the weather at present was, as they say, just what the doctor ordered. At least it seemed so. Cloud covered the sky at an altitude of about 600 to 900 meters. Visibility underneath was excellent. Soon we were anxious to see a glimpse of the coastline ahead and scanned the sky for lurking fighters. Don's navigation was perfect. We should have reached our target in about 10 minutes. I strained forward to see the distant coastline. There it was, a thin pencil line on the horizon. That tower over there must be the lighthouse. Don checked the position of the landmark against the map, and we altered course slightly to make a more accurate trek to the coast. It was still a few kilometers to the coast when I saw two ships, German destroyers or torpedo boats. Damn it, they couldn't help but notice us, and would certainly relay the warning to the coastal defense units and the Luftwaffe. I went off to the right hoping to go unnoticed, but we were out of luck. Both ships began zigzagging and increasing their speed, which we noticed from their keel waters. As a result, instead of crossing the coast north of Esbjerg, we crossed it a few kilometers south. We could both hear a slight howl in our radios, which we knew was the result of interference from the German ground radar trying to pick us up. For a moment I considered attacking the two ships, but as we had no bombs, I considered it pointless. So we continued to fly over the coast, climbing a little to cross the dunes. Ahead lay the fertile flat Danish countryside, and as we continued our way over fields and hedgerows, Don and I briefly discussed whether we should stop flying. Now we had no doubt lost the vital factor of surprise, so the cards did not lie at all in our favour. Then we noticed that the howling in the radio had stopped. They've lost us. All they know is we're somewhere over their territory, and trying to find us now will be like looking for a needle in a haystack. What do you say, Don? Do we keep flying? Okay, let's go ahead. Unfortunately, we did not take into account the effective service of the enemy ground observation posts, which at that moment by phone reported our progress to the headquarters of the Luftwaffe Air Defence in Denmark. We had become embroiled in the fighting, and there was now no question of returning. If I felt a vague uneasiness at the time, that feeling soon left me. In spite of the bad omens, we still believed in success. We were not alarmed even when, just as we were crossing Jutland in an easterly direction, we were fired upon from several small vessels over its coast, north of the island of Funen. This only showed us both that the enemy was on the alert. The weather seemed to be improving and the clouds, our shelter, were disappearing. It was then that Don noticed the radio masts at Kalundborg, on the west coast of Zealandia, the largest of Denmark's islands, on which lay its capital, Copenhagen. Long before the war, having tuned my parents' receiver to Radio Kalundborg, I imagined that one day I would see it from an airplane on a war mission. We still kept on course, hoping that periodic changes of direction of 30 or so degrees would throw the Germans off our trail. Finally, we saw the green towers of the cathedral at Roskilde in the distance and turned south, crossing the island of Men and the Baltic Sea. By this time there were no clouds in the sky, and we heard the howling in our radio again. We had no doubt that the Huns had discovered where we were. Seeing the German coast looming in the distance, we began to turn around to return home. As we glided over the waters of the Baltic, Don quickly gave a rough course to take us back to the island of Men and on to home. There were clouds to the north and west, and although their lower edge was well over 600, conditions were much more favourable. We decided it would be wiser to fly over the Jutland coast at about the same point where we had crossed it. The faint howling in our receiver was now heard almost continuously, so I reminded Don to keep looking back to see if any German fighters would appear. I surveyed the area ahead, flying low over hedgerows and fields and unintentionally scaring the peaceful Danish residents and their cattle. It was the only way to stay out of sight, or at least make it difficult for the enemy fighters to see. Don, of course, was constantly making small course corrections. We had reached about the middle of the island of Funen when we saw a large house. A large swastika flag was flying over the roof of this formerly apparently private mansion. Just at that moment an automobile came out of the gate and onto the country road. Seeing all this, we were speeding at 390 km/h. I was convinced that it was a staff car, so I pulled the Mossy up and started turning until we reached an altitude of about 460 meters. At least we could stop whoever was travelling in this vehicle. Perhaps there was an important Nazi official or, better yet, some Gestapo pig. Quickly turning on the electric sight, I took the helm slightly away from me, putting the plane into a gentle dive at 420 km. Ahead, about 800 meters away, was a car. Perhaps its passengers thought we were German pilots and were making a low-altitude welcome pass. At 500 from the car, which was now in my sight, I pressed the down button on the helm. Mossy shuddered slightly, and the cabin was filled with the odour of cordite, while a stream of shells and bullets poured from our guns. First the shots kicked up dirt from the roadside ditch, and then the car was crumpled by armour-piercing and bursting shells and bullets. I nearly slammed into the ground, concentrating on the gunfire, but Don yelled "pull out" over the intercom, and I yanked the steering wheel toward me, just in time to leap over a few small trees. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw that the car had tipped over into a ditch and smoke was billowing from it. "We stopped the bastard," Don remarked. From the excitement we almost forgot our own position, but we realized almost immediately that this little bit of violence would certainly find us out. So we didn't linger to get a better look at the results of our work, but continued our flight with more wariness than ever. We would be over Ringkøbing Fjord in 20 minutes. Don's information was encouraging, for just at this point we wanted to cross the west coast of Jutland. Only over the North Sea could we relax. The range of the German fighters prevented them from following us. Perhaps our low-level attack made me overconfident. The layer of clouds looked good, although positioned a little higher than I would have liked, but no one was now firing at us and no unfriendly aircraft were in sight. We were almost out of enemy-occupied territory, flying over the beautiful, peaceful Danish countryside. A narrow fjord showed up with a strip of sand dunes separating it from the grey North Sea. I pondered this fruitless excursion. Next time we planned to make a similar raid to Norway, where we could fare well. My musings were interrupted by a disturbing message. The two fighters approaching from the rear hemisphere. Damn it. How far out, Don? Before he answered, I cast a quick glance over my shoulder and saw them 1.5 kilometers away. They were approaching fast. I was so close to the ground I couldn't dive to pick up speed quickly, so I moved the throttle sector levers all the way forward. We only had to wait a few precious seconds for the airplane to accelerate. Why I was flying at 390 km, I don't know. We were supposed to be leaving enemy territory at 480 km, and since our top speed was almost the same as the Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 19, it was doubtful that either of them would intercept us. Having unbuckled the tether straps, Don was now on his knees looking backward. That way he could give me accurate information on the distance and position of the enemy, who we identified as two Focke 190s. As soon as we reached a speed of 450 Q2, I sharply took the helm, directing Mossy almost vertically to the clouds, knowing full well that if I could not escape into their thin layer, our chances of rescue would be slim. With only one fighter chasing us, we could probably defend ourselves as we had done in the past. Two planes, on the other hand, was changing matters. It was only a matter of time before one of them drove us into a position where the second fighter would fire a killer line. The pair of Focke-Wulfs had now separated. One was about 400 meters in front of the other. "Attention, Bob. That bastard is about in firing range?" During the almost vertical climb, the Mossy gradually lost speed. Nevertheless, the saving clouds were still 600 above us, much higher than I thought. I stopped climbing and at the same moment started a steep left turn with the steering wheel against my stomach. Everything went black in my eyes as the overload caused the blood to rush from my head to my legs. This moment saved us, for the Hun could not follow us on the steep turn. As soon as he broke away, I went into a turn in the opposite direction. Meanwhile, this Focke-Wulf had gone up, and making a turn on the slide, came in front of me. We were now 600 metres above Jutland, but while concentrating on one, I completely forgot about the second fighter. It was a mistake that young pilots are always warned about, and now, with 4 years of combat experience, I did make it. The first Focke-Wulf was rapidly approaching, and suddenly I saw ominous flickering flashes in its nose and wings as it opened fire with guns and machine guns. It seemed impossible for him to miss, but to my amazement there were no hits, and I even forgot to press the trigger of my own gun as he filled my sight for a moment. But now it was too late. I realized this when I heard Don's anxious voice, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a second Focke-Wulf rapidly approaching from below on my right. I began a desperate turn toward it, simultaneously gaining altitude to make it as difficult as possible for him to aim, but it was too late. During my vigorous maneuver, the Mossy lost speed, and as my right plane descended, the plane shuddered with hits from 30 shells and bullets. The Focke-Wulf was so close that its entire nose seemed to be drowned in flames as the guns fired. My mouth went dry. The left engine and wing were on fire, and I expected at any moment an explosion that would consign us to oblivion. We seemed to dive vertically into the North Sea. At that moment, another line blew apart the dashboard and the side lantern panels. I never realized why the bullets didn't find Don or me. I remembered to say to Don, "Great, we got us." I didn't know how to get out of the dive before we crashed. Even though I realized we were going to die, I no longer felt fear. I only experienced concern for my family, as they occupied all my thoughts for that fleeting moment. Perhaps this prompted me to make a vigorous attempt to save us. I pulled the wheel as hard as I could, and by some miracle the airplane reacted and began to pull out of the deadly dive. We levelled off over the water, flying parallel to the coast about 200 metres from the shore. Turning off the left engine, I told Don to flug the propeller to reduce the braking effect of its slowly rotating blades. Out of excitement, he hit the wrong toggle switch and nearly stopped our serviceable engine. Fortunately, I saw it in time and, brushing his hand away, corrected the mistake. At the same time, I turned on the left engine's built-in fire extinguisher, hoping to knock down the flames. But it had already gotten too strong and continued to hang on. In those brief seconds, I discovered that we still partially retained control and could stay 100 metres above the shore. At this point, Don reported, "They have reappeared." Glancing over my shoulder, I saw the enemy approaching from above from behind to finish us off. There was the noise again as the shells slammed into my good old Mossy. I prop the top hatch, landing forced on the beach. I shouted. I knew that there was no escape in the air, and our only chance of survival was a parachute landing on a sandy beach, provided that our riddled with damage the airplane didn't explode on impact. I throttled down the serviceable engine as Don dropped the top hatch, flying in the airstream over our tail. I even thought, not unenthusiastically, that it would hit one of our pursuers, but no such miracle occurred. Our speed was gradually decreasing, and as we were preparing to land on our bellies, both fighters flew about 8 metres above us. For a second, I had a chance for one quick win to avenge myself. All I had to do was pull the helm slightly and press the gun release. But I was so engrossed in landing on the uneven sandbank that the thought only flashed through my mind. Anyhow, it was a hopeless endeavour. The impact with the ground violently pressed the harness straps into our shoulders. A jump into the air, then the impact again at 240 QA. I couldn't release the landing gear because, of course, the airplane would immediately flip onto its back as its wheels bogged down in the soft sand. And with the landing gear retracted, we skidded across the sand and came to a quick stop. Only one wing was in the water. The rest of the airplane was on the shore. Despite the cuts and bruises he received, Don kicked the side cockpit door open with his foot while I climbed out through the overhead hatch. I think we broke all records getting out of our billowing airplane. It could have exploded at any moment, so we rushed to run down the beach under the protection of the dunes. Our feet got stuck in the sand, and after about 20 steps we ran out of breath and stopped for a break. Looking up, we saw both Focke-Wulfs come into attack and start dive-bombing us. That was the end of it. I had no doubt that they were going to shoot us. There was no cover nearby, and we couldn't run away. We just stood there and prayed. When they roared over us about 6 metres away, The leader, whose helmeted head I could clearly see, waved at us. I waved back, and as they winged off to their base I thought what chivalrously honest opponents they were. The hum of their engines subsided, and gradually there would have been silence had it not been for the crackling of the fire that was devouring the wreckage of our airplane. "No. God, it's a hell of a long way home," I said. I don't know what I expected Don to say to that obvious statement, but suddenly, as if in shock, I felt incredibly alone. Regardless of what happened, it looked like it would be a long time before I could see my family again, and there was certainly the grim prospect of never seeing them again. Don was as silent as I was, stunned by our crash and escape from death, but I was sure similar thoughts were running through his mind as well. This was only his second sortie with me, though he'd spent a successful Torsturm on a Mitchell before that. He had only been married for a few months, and as he was older than me, he had turned 38. This probably acted much harder on him. We saw that we had landed on the sand spit that separated Ringkøbing Fjord from the North Sea. Our immediate task was to try to hide before dark. We had been in the air for almost 4 hours. The day was already drawing to a close. As we climbed the sand dunes, I kept thinking that it was now evening tea time at home. If we could hold out until dark, perhaps we could count on help from the friendly Danes to get us to Sweden and then home. We reached a fairly high point in the dunes, which gave a good view and provided some shelter. We took the maps with us from the airplane, and, since they were not to fall into German hands, buried them. We also buried our life jackets, but I decided to keep my Luger pistol. It was a trophy. An intelligence officer had taken it for me from a German prisoner of war shot down over England. I thought it might be useful as a means of persuasion, in case any Danes decided to be unkind. After discussing our situation, we calmed down and even believed in the possibility of avoiding capture. On a narrow road closer to the inner edge of the fjord, we spotted a house. It seemed empty. Perhaps we could take shelter there until dusk. Suddenly, a kilometre and a half away, I found a large camouflaged structure, in which we immediately recognized a German radar. I had flown over the area several times before, but because of the excellent camouflage I had never noticed it. I thought that the soldiers from there were probably on their way to arrest us, and soon I saw that they were indeed heading towards us in a disorderly, dispersed group. They were now no more than 400 meters away, or a little more. We could hear their guttural commands. Surely they must have spotted us. Before we could duck to the ground to be out of their sight, they opened fire with machine guns, and for the first time in my life I heard the whistle of bullets flying nearby, and I rolled down the back slope of the dune. There was no point in trying to fight against a superior force with one gun, so we, shrunken down and looking rather undignified, sat and waited for them to come upon us. The first to appear were 2 or 3 soldiers, led by a non-commissioned officer. They were Luftwaffe ground personnel. Neither Don nor I spoke German. The non-commissioned officer began to search us. He quickly found my pistol and was obviously not happy about it. Pushing, they led us back to our still burning airplane. At first I was convinced that they were going to shoot us and throw us into the fire, but the non-commissioned officer asked, "Moment?" I understood absolutely nothing, but I nodded. I suppose he wanted to know if there were any bombs on board. He hummed and hurried with us and the rest of his squad to the observation post near the radar. There he pushed us into a small room. One of the Germans went out and returned with 2 cups of ersatz coffee. Regardless of the quality of the drink, we were grateful. My mouth was dry. As I slowly sipped the hot beverage, my mind slowly realized the fact that the war was over for both of us. I was numb with shock and could barely look into Don's stern face, because I knew everything had happened for a reason. Experience should have ordered me to turn back at the very beginning when we were spotted from the German ships. Having decided to continue the flight, I made many other mistakes. I did not get alarmed when it was obvious that the entire German air defence in Denmark became aware of our presence, did not fly at maximum speed on the way back, and finally made a major blunder, concentrating on the first German plane in the battle, missed the second deadly for us fighter. These were the main mistakes. There were other, minor ones. My parents, having spent a large sum of money on my education, hoped that I would choose one of the serious professions. I would follow in the footsteps of my father, a vicar of the Church of England, or perhaps I would stop at medicine. But none of these subjects interested me, and soon after obtaining my school certificate at Taunton, at the end of 1936, I left school and joined the Lancashire Police Department at Wigan as an assistant clerk. My aim at this stage was to learn the basics of police work and later apply for recruitment to the colonial police force. After a year or so working as a police clerk, I grew bored with the job, and friends persuaded me to join the merchant navy. My father was adamantly opposed to this, and I suppose the result of this conflict was that in December 1937, determined to send it all to hell, I applied to the Royal Air Force for short-term service as an officer. Signing up along with a large number of eager and more suitable applicants, I was astonished to find that I was among the relatively few accepted. A few weeks later, I went to the initial flight training school at Desford, near Leicester. It was one of several such schools, staffed by civilian instructors but funded by the Air Ministry. It was typical of most flying clubs emerging at the time. A small grass airfield with 2 or 3 hangars, a few administrative and service buildings, a clubhouse that served as a canteen for the cadets and staff, and a row of buildings with bachelor apartments for us cadets. My comrades on this initial flight training course came from all parts of the Commonwealth of Nations. We were a happy and carefree group. I made friends with a fellow named David Blomley, with whom I was placed in the same room. On March 9, we were led to the parking lot and introduced to our planes, delightful little tiger moths. They were lined up in rows ready to take to the air with instructors and cadets. At this point, I was excited and looking forward to the flight. 30 minutes later, when we landed, it was a different story. Having been subjected to all kinds of textbook aerial acrobatic maneuvers, a very green Briem, wobbly, barely made it out of a tiger moth with the flight designation G Advith. But recovery was quick, and within a few hours we were back in the blue sky. This time it went much calmer and gentler. Breham was learning the basics of flying. Just when I thought I was ready to fly solo, my instructor was replaced, probably because of my rather slow progress, which I must admit was beginning to worry me as well. Most of the cadets took to the air on their own after about 8 hours of flying with an instructor. We knew that if we did not complete a solo flight within 15 hours, our training would end there. My only consolation was the fact that Blomley had the same problem. He flew 15 hours with an instructor before he was deemed ready to fly solo, and successfully did so. Finally, after a half-flight, my instructor left his seat behind and said, "You are ready. I want you to take off, circle, and land. Any questions?" "No, sir." Finally, after 14 hours with my instructor, I was flying solo. It was a beautiful day, and I wanted to fly in circles for as long as possible. But at this stage, I didn't want to tarnish my reputation, so after completing the circle, I began a smooth planned turn for my first landing. It was a challenge. The ground was rapidly approaching. My speed and my tail were a little higher than necessary, and upon touching the ground, my airplane bounced in a frightening way. Remembering what my instructors had said, I gave full throttle and took off with an altitude gain to reland. I circled again, repeating to myself out loud the things I should not have forgotten to do. In this way, I gained confidence and made a flawless landing on the second attempt. I slowly taxied to where my instructor was standing, expecting an explosion of swearing at me. Instead, he congratulated me and was generally very nice. Now time went very fast in Desford. In the evenings, our young blood brought doom to the pubs in Desford with our obscene songs and wild amusements. We were not yet members of the Royal Air Force. We wore no uniforms and had no ranks. However, our pay was on a par with that of a Royal Air Force pilot officer. 11 shillings 10 pence a day. We knew how to get rid of him in a frighteningly short time. At this stage, Hitler was already beginning to apply pressure, and we all felt that if we were unlucky, the war would start before we were ready to join the squadrons, as it would be many months before we could complete our training. Finally, at Desford, came the day of the final air test. For this arduous test, I was introduced to the instructor, Flight Lieutenant Wheatley. He explained what I was to accomplish, and we took off together. I was fairly confident in everything except instrument flying, so when he told me to raise the hood over the cockpit, I wasn't happy. I realized that things weren't going too well. Then, getting nervous, I started making serious mistakes. Finally, Wheatley said, "All right, Bram, you can take the cap off." I was sure I failed, as he said nothing more until we landed. Then he took me aside and listed the mistakes I had made. Finally, he said, "Okay, that's all, but pay attention to your instrument flight. Good luck." That's how I got over the first step. Then, after a short leave, we had to report to the Royal Air Force Centre at Exbridge for a 2-week mushrooming. At Axbridge, Bromley and I were again assigned to an apartment together. I wonder why airmen needed to worry about such things as formation training. However, we were now in the Royal Air Force, and it was our responsibility for the 2 weeks required to equip us with uniforms. The drill and the reading of the regulations tightened us up, and eventually we received our uniforms and lined up for the final review. We felt proud to belong to the Royal Air Force, but none of us still had the coveted wings. Towards the end of May 1938, we were told that we were going to Royal Air Force flying schools. Dave Blomley and I were to arrive at the 11th Royal Air Force Air School, which had just opened at Shawbury, near Shrewsbury. During a short vacation, I went home and took Dave with me. My parents seemed to be used to the idea that my career would be in aviation, so the vacation was enjoyable. Dave took a keen interest in my sister, leaving me free to pursue my own interests. For the next 3 months, we flew 2-seat, single-engine Hawker, Hart and Odex biplanes. The instructors had to cordon off our suitability to fly fighters, bombers, and other types of air operations. By passing this course, we could receive our wings. It was obvious to all of us that we had a military career ahead of us, that we would have to put in a lot of hard work in the air and on the ground if we were to succeed. With the exception of the squadron leaders, most of our instructors were NCOs. Great guys, most of them had served for many years, starting out as technicians and later retraining as pilots. I had to relearn a lot of things. After the Tiger Moth, these airplanes seemed more difficult to fly. Dave had the same problems, but we progressed quickly. One effective punishment for a bad departure was to wash one of the planes with soap and water, a long and tedious task. I did quite a bit of such work. One day, Flight Lieutenant Bax, the squadron commander, called all of us up and told us that we could choose which type of aviation we would prefer to serve in. He remarked that he couldn't guarantee it, but that our choice would be taken into account if possible. Most of the cadets, including David, chose heavy aircraft, E-bomber or coastal aviation. They were driven by the desire to gain as much experience as possible, flying multi-engine aircraft in their short time in the Royal Air Force. Such experience would come in handy if they wanted to join a passenger or charter airline after their service. Fighter planes seemed too small for civilian passenger aviation. I had no desire to become a civilian pilot and was still nurturing my dreams of joining the Colonial Police after the Royal Air Force. Besides, I loved aerobatics and elegant single-seat fighter planes appealed to me, so I chose fighter planes. Towards the end of the junior course, cadets had to practice night flying. We all thought it was quite dangerous and not very necessary because of the very limited navigational aids that were available for night flying in those days. Before night sorties, a van was towed to the takeoff point, along with a good luck fire, and a duty instructor was stationed there all night. In addition, flares were placed along the trajectory to point the pilot in the direction of takeoff and landing. I soon found that I could fully enjoy night flying. As the initial training drew to a close, the pace picked up. Preparation for the forthcoming wings examinations limited our visits to Shrewsbury. I expected to do satisfactorily in most of the subjects, but I dared not expect to do well in the remaining ones. The drill test was one that sticks in my memory. I was given command of a squad of cadets and had to lead them in weapons exercises and passing in front of the chief instructor in formation training. Unfortunately, due to the wet weather outside, the trials were moved to one of the large hangars. When my squad was marching into position, it was as if I had lost the power of speech from excitement and did not give the command to stop in time. My comrades calmly marched straight into the wall of the hangar, loyal to the death. I doubt the drill instructor was impressed with the brilliant performance. I performed the flight test satisfactorily and flew better on instruments this time. The test was short and the officer taking it made no special remarks. Most of us passed all the examinations, and on August 20, 1938, 4 months after my 18th birthday, I received my Royal Air Force wings. A few days later, we were lined up in full dress uniform, and the commanding officer of the air station, Grupp Captain Lale, formally presented us with our wings ins. This was a turning point for me. I felt that I was now truly in the Royal Air Force, but soon discovered that I still had much to learn. At the end of August, after returning from leave, we were assembled and briefed regarding the future. Although most of us chose bombers or other heavy aircraft and only 4 preferred fighter planes, it was decided that our course should produce 15 fighter pilots. This was a consequence of the growing tensions in Europe and the approaching Munich crisis. Royal Air Force Command wanted to build up the Air Defence Fighter Air Force as quickly as possible, and I was pleased that my choice would become a reality. Some others who wanted to train in heavy aircraft, however, experienced disappointment. Each of us was given the opportunity to fly a second flight with an instructor in a Hawker Hart. And then, after a verbal briefing on the fuel system and general characteristics of the Hawker Fury single-seat biplane fighter, we were put into the cockpit of this delightful little airplane and, before we came to our senses, invited to check it out in the sky. By this time, the Fury had all but ceased to be used in fighter squadrons in the UK, much to the disappointment of those pilots who had flown it and loved it. With honour transferred to the squadrons of advanced training air schools, and their place in the squadrons of the first line of fighter command took Gladiators, the new Hurricanes and the first Spitfire. After the Hart and Odex, I found it easy to fly the Fury. Its horizontal speed in a straight line from 290 to 320 km really meant something after only 145 Q2 in the Tiger Moth or 225 QK in the Hart and Odex. To me, it was already a real flying experience. My enthusiasm and lack of experience caused trouble. I loved aerobatics, and after hearing about fast barrels, I decided to experiment on my next flight in a Fury. Unfortunately, no one told me how to perform this maneuver. Fast barrel rolls were discouraged because doing them at too high a speed could exceed the allowable overloads for the airplane. As I took off that time, I began to climb to gain a safe altitude of approximately 2450 meters. I had completely forgotten about the significant reduction of speed to a value slightly above the critical speed, and at 260 km. I pulled the control stick sharply towards my belly and at the same time hit the right rudder pedal sharply. The result was extremely spectacular. How it worked out I don't know, but eventually the Fury levelled out on its own and a very frightened pilot tried to assess the situation. The wings and tailplane were still in place, but lateral movements of the control stick did not cause any roll. Deciding that I had walked into a trap, I started to unbuckle my harness in preparation to parachute out. But after a final check of the controls, I found that I had enough power to maneuver smoothly on the Fury. I buckled up again and began a cautious descent toward the airfield. Finally, the airfield came into view, and with a very bad feeling I made a wide circle and landed without further incident. What was I to say to my squadron commander? I decided it was best to tell the truth. The punishment was a thorough whipping plus an airplane that had to be washed and scrubbed with soap. Another time, on a very windy day, I landed rather carelessly across the wind, causing the Fury to scrape the ground with the tip of one wing. There was no major damage to the airplane, but unfortunately the senior flight training instructor, Squadron Leader Johnson, saw this oversight, and when I got out of the airplane he greeted me by saying, "Gosh, do you realize what you're doing?" I didn't know what to answer, so another airplane was scrubbed by me. October 1938. We were mostly spent polishing our aerial firing skills before a month's tour of duty at the Penrose Range on the North Wales coast. All the cadets were looking forward to it. It was the highest and closest point of our training to air combat. We arrived at Penrose at the end of the month and found a very busy schedule of training sorties awaiting us, starting at dawn and ending at dusk. Platoons of fighters attacked ground targets while the bomber guys dropped training bombs from their new twin-engine training Oxfords. Fury was equipped with 2 Vickers machine guns firing through the propeller hub, which used a mechanism designed by Constantinescu to avoid hitting the blades. Attacks on ground targets were accompanied by firing at the canvas towed by a Hart or Odex. I liked that the best. I could imagine how pilots like Ball, Manick, Bishop and Richardson felt as they dive-bombed the enemy. After 1 or 2 aerial target firings, I began to achieve very accurate hits on the webbing and felt that the long period of training was finally beginning to pay off. Training on the range was over all too quickly, and on December 2 I received orders to fly to Shawbury where, after completing our training, we were to await assignment. But before that everyone had to pass a final flying and navigation test while flying the Hearth with Flight Lieutenant Stubbs, the Link commander. I did satisfactorily. Then one day we were assembled in the lecture hall and informed of our assignments. It was a welcome day. As the names and squadrons were read out, I was getting more and more excited. I wanted to be in either the Gladiator Squadron or one of the new Hurricanes or Spitfires. Finally, my name was read. Temporary Pilot Officer Braham, 29 Squadron Debden, Essex. As soon as we were released, I sought out one of our instructors, Pilot Officer Brooks, and asked him what aircraft this squadron was equipped with. In his opinion, they must have been Gladiators. I was satisfied. David Blomley was to join the 1st Squadron at Tangier, equipped with Hurricanes. After a splendid farewell party, we were given a few days' leave before arriving at our squadrons. I now felt like an experienced pilot. Soon I was to learn something very different. I had not honoured my decision to report the senseless killing of the boy. The boy's death paled in comparison to everything that had happened during the patrol. Nevertheless, I regretted my silence, and I still feel guilty. Perhaps if I had spoken up, things would have been different. Although, to be honest, I don't think so. I didn't speak up because I didn't believe they would pay attention to such an insignificant death among so many deaths. But what I feared most was the threatened repercussions if I blamed a dead soldier whose body had been mutilated by the enemy. In the end, concern for my own safety took precedence over a disturbed conscience. Today, as I reflect on everything that happened to me, it surprises me that I still agonize over the fact that I failed to speak out openly and officially record the circumstances of the boy's death. By remaining silent and knowing that others would remain silent as well, it was as if I had blotted out his very existence. Who would know what happened to this boy? Now dead are another matter. They're all accounted for. By the evening of the next day after we returned to camp, the results of Corporal Thomas's mission report were known to all. Sergeant Stone, missing in action, risking his life in an enemy minefield to protect his patrol, was posthumously awarded the Bronze Star. Corporal Doll, killed in action while attacking an enemy position, was posthumously awarded the Bronze Star and promoted to the rank of sergeant. The crew of a helicopter shot down in action, and the soldiers killed and wounded in action, are presented with the Presidential Commendation for destroying a fortified enemy position despite superior enemy forces. Corporal Thomas successfully accomplished the task. His report contained the essential facts which Lieutenant Cauldron embellished as unwritten military custom required. If possible, a body should not be sent home without an order or medal. If possible, it should not be listed as missing in action without special commendation. Orders and medals comfort a grief-stricken family, Lieutenant. Awards add more weight to the funeral ceremony. The Army has an obligation to maintain morale both at home and here. It's the only way to get this dirty work done. Do you understand, Lieutenant? Yes, sir. I understand. Yes, sir, Lieutenant Cauldron understood. As did Corporal Jefferson Thomas, who made his report, and my friend Blondie, who kept his mouth shut. And now I understand. But the Army is a sensitive mechanism, always alert to possible threats. In the days that followed, it heard grumblings of soldiers dissatisfied with Dole's command. It heard about the panic that had arisen in the gully and the near mutiny of the soldiers. It heard bad rumours that the medics had extracted American bullets from Dole's crushed skull. The Army sifted through this information and took appropriate action. Within a week, all the soldiers of the 2 units operating in the Hollow were separately reassigned to other combat units. Blondie, as I've said, was transferred to another company. Thomas was rewarded with an assignment to a rear area where it was not necessary to carry a gun. Of all the soldiers involved in the Holloway operation, I was the only one who remained in Cambine on the Central Plateau. 2 weeks after the successful completion of our mission, intelligence reported that the enemy had returned to the Hollow and was stockpiling new supplies. No further action was taken to dislodge him from there. Instead, the Hollow was marked on our maps as a fortified enemy position along with the Western Hills. After that, the Army sent patrols to other locations. A few months later, when I was long gone from the Central Plateau, Cambini Base came under heavy rocket and artillery fire from the gully, and enemy units stormed the camp at night. The siege was not lifted until 2 weeks later. Our losses were among the heaviest of the war. I read the newspaper accounts with special interest. One essay called these battles a brilliant example of American resistance under siege that will go down in the annals of our military history, along with the Battle of Ardennes and the Siege of the Alamo. Cambine was subsequently deemed to be of no strategic importance, and our troops were withdrawn from there. Amen. I was fully occupied with routine patrolling in the valley for the purpose of detecting and destroying the enemy, and the events and participants of that first patrol receded into the background of my memory. Every patrol carries danger and requires constant vigilance. I realized this early on, and soon became a hardy, hardened infantryman. I did my job and kept to myself. I shouldn't have made too close a friendship. In Vietnam, relationships don't last long. I learned that from my brief friendship with Blondie. In the first days after his transfer, I missed him. There was no one to complain to, no one to lean on. And to my surprise, I also missed Thomas. He had a toughness and self-confidence that I'd never seen in my entire service. Without them, I felt vulnerable and realized that my salvation now depended solely on myself. When you are separated from your comrades, you feel loneliness, but at the same time you are freed from unnecessary worries and sufferings and do not go crazy seeing people die. And yet I never got used to killing. I just got over it somehow and kept on serving. The first few weeks of patrolling were not the same as before. They were unusually quiet. We stayed out of the hollow and didn't encounter the enemy. We found minefields but no casualties. We came across Viet Cong caves, but they were empty. We encountered peasants in black pajamas tilling rice paddies. They showed no hostility, and we did not touch them. The absence of the enemy in the valley greatly improved my mood. I considered it a stroke of luck that I had stayed in Cambina. It turned out to be a quiet area where the boundaries were clearly drawn, and if neither side crossed them, there were no clashes. That suited me just fine. I had an easy time walking through the hot valley by day and resting on the cool plateau at night. But it didn't last long. In Vietnam, nothing is permanent except the heat. There are only breaks. The break in my quiet life came one morning on the outskirts of a village a mile north of where Sergeant Stone had killed the boy. I remembered him for the first time in 3 weeks because he said he came from that village. Until then, we had been patrolling to the south, but now we received orders to survey the village itself. There were reports that the Viet Cong were showing up in the village, seizing food and terrorizing the peasants for cooperating with the Americans. The villagers were considered friendly to us, and although there were minor skirmishes nearby, there was no indication of Viet Cong support in the village itself. Before we set out, Lieutenant Cauldron personally briefed us, explaining that our task was extremely delicate. We were to ascertain, without arousing the hostility of the inhabitants, the extent to which the Viet Cong were disturbing the peasants. Maintaining the peasants' friendly attitude was important for the safety of the base, especially since this village was considered a model example of our old pacification program and the new Vietnamesization policy. One of the soldiers asked what the difference was, but the lieutenant sharply besieged him. Don't get smart. This is not a question and answer night, it's a briefing. Sit and listen. He was addressing mainly the patrol leader, Sergeant Axe, a cautious old-school veteran, respected for taking care of his soldiers. I had been out in the field with him before. He was stern, fatherly toward the soldiers, and diplomatic with the officers. As a result, he was well liked by both sides, a rare thing amongst NSOs. And Sergeant Axe, you know this village as well as anyone on this base, Lieutenant Cauldron said. That's why I put you in charge of the patrol. We want to know if the villagers are scared and why. We want to know if the Charlies are taking their rice. We want to know if they're harboring Charlies. If the Charlie have infiltrated the village, we need to drive them out without disturbing the villagers. We need their benevolent attitude. I know this is a difficult task. It means we must gather intelligence without harming these people. No one must hit them or threaten them with weapons. Remember, they are allies. Cauldron looked angrily at the soldiers. Don't you smirk. I know what you're thinking, but we're not going to raze this village to the ground. We want to live in peace with it as long as our base exists. That's the way it is. So guys, be careful. No shooting. If you see Viet Cong in the field, don't shoot until they fire first. No guns in the village at all, only in case of an open attack. If anyone messes up, battalion headquarters will skin you. I've been instructed to do just that. You gather information and look for signs, like fear among the villagers, weapons, young gooks hiding in huts, anything that seems suspicious. If you catch any suspicious types, bring them here for questioning, and no roughhousing. We'll do the questioning ourselves. One question, Lieutenant. What is it, Sergeant? If we do apprehend someone, can't we drag him with us until we get back? It's no good keeping him too long in the village. I know these people. Good question. Get all the suspects out into the field, away from the village, and radio in. We'll send an armed truck to pick them up. Any other questions? All right, then go. Return before dark. We left the base on the main road. It led down the plateau, winding between the rocks, to the outskirts of the village on the northern edge of the valley. Normally there was heavy traffic here, with trucks carrying supplies and moving troops. But it was only 8 o'clock, and the trucks didn't leave until 9 o'clock. By then we would reach the village. It was less than an hour's walk, and all uphill. Nevertheless, every step was difficult. It was hot and the road was dry. We were kicking up clouds of dust that covered our hands and faces. There was no such thing as a pleasant walk in Vietnam, especially for foot soldiers. There were 6 of us, and we walked in pairs. In front were Sergeant Axe and his deputy, then 2 soldiers, followed by me and another soldier. I didn't know anyone but the sergeant. When we were halfway through and a village showed below, my neighbour spoke up. He informed me that his last name was Hammer, and I gave mine as Glass. He laughed, and I had to smile. He was a big, obese guy who looked more like a pudding than a hammer. He grumbled about the lieutenant's instructions at the briefing. Hammer had his own ideas about pacifying a village where the Viet Cong might be. Destroy first, then interrogate. And the more he talked, the more he lived up to his last name, if not in appearance, then in character. He told me that the last time they had searched a friendly village, his best friend had been killed by a Viet Cong hiding in one of the huts. Hammer said he spotted the Gook trying to run away and took him down with 1 shot. In the hut, he found his friend killed by knife blows. Then, there was a young wench lying on the floor, roaring like a cow. I figured it was that Gook's wench, and that she had been used as bait for my friend. He wasn't the type to be caught off guard. He was a cautious guy, but this whore must have caught his eye. She was really beautiful, even in her dirty pajamas. At other times I wouldn't have minded messing around with her myself, but not now, with my friend lying next to me. She yelled at me, and I put a few bullets right in her chest. That calmed her down for good. The anger in his eyes faded. He was my best friend. We worked together for 9 months. This happened about 2 months ago. He was supposed to go home in 3 weeks. We were going to stick together in the States, maybe start some business. He had a real business head. I looked at him but didn't say anything. He took my silence for sympathy. "Hey, there's no point in making friends in this shithole," he said. "Nothing good lasts long in this goddamn war." No. I agreed with him on that, and he smiled broadly at me. "Listen, Glass, I don't know how long you've been here, but don't ever go into their huts alone." "All right. We got to stick together, help each other out." "Yeah. Hammer and Glass, Hammer and Glass. Sounds good to me." He was looking for a replacement for his dead buddy, but he couldn't know I wasn't the man for it yet. We arrived at the village around 9 o'clock. Children were playing in the dust on the road. They immediately surrounded us with outstretched hands, begging for food and sweets. We had nothing to give them, so Sergeant Axe shooed them away, but they kept following us, hoping to get something. At last I couldn't stand it any longer, so I took a tin of dry rations out of my satchel and threw it far back on the road. The children rushed after it. The sergeant looked at me askew, and Hammer smiled derisively and called me a simpleton. I paid no attention. As we moved on, we met no grown men at all. There were only old men standing or squatting in the dust in front of the huts. They looked at us with the eyes of old men who had learned the bitterness of life and resigned themselves to it. I wonder what these tired, weary people were thinking. For example, about the endless war raging around them. Their life was so simple, all of it spent in this village and the fields surrounding it. What do they think of strangers invading their village? How do they understand the constant movement of helicopters cutting through their blue skies, of tanks and half-treks turning their green fields around, of armed patrols slapping through their rice nylers where they cultivate the land? I've read that most people in remote villages don't know the name of their president or the location of their government. We in the States know both, and have come here to spread our ideas, though neither they understand us nor we them. They do, however, understand the language of the guns and smile at us when we step past their thatched huts. It is their only means of defence. Sergeant Axe decided to begin his survey in the market square. This was the vital centre of the village, and at this early hour there was already a brisk trade going on. Both sellers and buyers were women. There was not a single man in sight. This is a typical village picture. All the healthy men were absent, some in the South Vietnamese armed forces, some fighting with the Viet Cong, some hiding somewhere. Any man of draft age was suspicious to both sides, and the family could only see him at nightfall, when he might not fear the scrutiny of the Americans and was wary only of the Viet Cong. We walked through the market square, keeping our rifles at the ready. The merchants and shoppers paid us no attention. American patrols were part of their daily lives. and they were apparently not bothered by the Pakidam's presence. At the end of the market, near one of the huts, a funeral ceremony was in progress, shrieking and crying. The dead old man lay on a wooden table, surrounded by burning candles emitting thick rings of smoke. The deceased's family members and friends, all women except 2 or 3 old men, sat cross-legged in a semicircle on the ground. From time to time one woman or another cried out, but no one tried to comfort her. It seemed to me that as soon as the crying of one of the mourners was silenced, another would come in, as if it were a funeral ritual. It was strange to see this ceremony in the midst of the busy market trade. But it was not so unusual in a country where life and death exist in such intimacy as I had never known. We had moved on when Hammer stopped, hesitating. His attention was attracted by the group of mourners nearest the deceased. Staring intently at them, he took Sergeant Axe aside and whispered something to him. I watched the sergeant study the mourners and followed his gaze. The 5 women in black had their heads down and were moaning and wailing. At intervals, one or the other would throw her head back and let out a loud wail. Only one small figure in the centre, whose face was hidden under a black cloak, remained motionless and silent. No, I tell you it's a man, Hammer said to the sergeant so loudly that all could hear him. I saw his face. He's about 17 or 18. That's the age of conscription for the Gooks. I'll prove it to you. We crowded around the sergeant. He shook his head. No. Let's just watch for a minute. You two, he pointed to the soldiers ahead of me, go around this group and keep your eyes open. Don't do anything without a good reason, and don't shoot indiscriminately. If it's a Gook, we'll take him quietly. Just make sure he doesn't try to run. The soldiers nodded and went to the opposite side of the funeral group, taking a position from where we could observe the front row of mourners. The 4 of us stood idly under a tree a few yards away from them. Sergeant Axe lit a cigarette and offered it to us. Everyone took one except me. I wanted to smoke marijuana to make the tightness in my chest go away, but I refrained. I hadn't smoked pot the last time I went out with this sergeant, and I didn't know how he felt about it. He was acting strictly by the book, and I didn't want to cross him. After watching the mourners for a few minutes, Hammer became impatient. Are we going to stand here all day, Sergeant? Why not just grab him and see if I'm right? We can't interfere with their ceremony. It'll turn the whole village against us. Did you hear what the lieutenant said? Nonsense, Sergeant. We're here to look for Jinx, aren't we? Yeah, but we're not sure he's Viet Cong. Maybe there's a woman under that cape after all. What the hell is a woman? Sitting there like a mummy. Why doesn't she sway and squeal like the others? We're waiting to find out. These stupid funerals can go on for hours, Hammer insisted. I've seen them howling that way all day. The sergeant's eyes narrow. Then, if it's a Viet Cong, he won't be able to stay still long, seeing what we're watching. He'll be up to something soon. We just have to wait. Hammer was clearly displeased, but he said nothing. I can't understand, said the corporal, why Charlie would be sitting at a funeral in broad daylight when there are patrols everywhere. Maybe the dead man is his father, suggested Hammer. Wouldn't you risk it if it were your old man's funeral? Oh no, the corporal grinned. I can't stand by old man. Hammer started to say something but stopped short. One of the women, who had been wailing the loudest, suddenly got up, walked over to the dead man, stood beside the motionless black figure, and sobbed bitterly. Then, pulling herself together, she bent down and kissed the dead man's sunken cheek. Then she turned abruptly, slipped through the group of mourners, and headed toward the market. Where the hell did she go? Hammer asked excitedly. Maybe she went shopping, the corporal said, and smiled at Hammer. I smile too. It's not funny, Hammer took offence. I think we should follow her. A woman stopped in front of one of the counters closest to us, talking to another woman. Yeah, Sergeant Axe said to Hammer, see where she goes, but don't do anything stupid. When you find out, come back here. We'll be waiting. Hammer went after the woman. I saw him walk over to the vegetable counter and stop a few feet away from the woman. He likes to play detective, the corporal said. Yes, agreed the sergeant, but he may have picked up on something. I don't think there's a woman squatting there either, but maybe it's a child, a dead man's grandchild. Children don't know how to cry at funerals. Let's watch a little longer. It's not 10 o'clock. We still have time. I liked the sergeant's calm approach to the situation. That surprised me. Another patrol chief would have broken up a funeral ceremony without regard for the people. Axe acted judiciously in an atmosphere of rudeness and brutality. It was gratifying. About 5 minutes later, Hammer returned. He looked astonished. The woman resumed her place by the coffin and resumed her mournful cries as if she were playing a part. The whole setting, the market square, the funeral ritual in front of the American soldiers, looked bizarre. To me, it was an exceptional sight, even in this strange war. It mesmerized and thrilled, foreshadowing a climax I could not have foreseen. What happened? Sergeant Axe asked Hammer. I followed her through the market. She talked to a few women and came back. He shrugged his shoulders in bewilderment. I don't understand. Now she's yelling over the corpse again. We're wasting our time, said the corporal. It's just a gook funeral. What's there to understand? Hammer's face flashed. How many young men have you seen in this whole village? The only one sitting by this very corpse. I saw his face. I smell Viet Cong. I'm telling you, it's Charlie. If the sergeant orders him, I bet he won't miss. Hammer looked at the sergeant. We can't take any chances. This village is peaceful for now. I want it to stay that way, and I won't allow any killing. What the hell do you care? Hammer shouted, losing patience. Can't we handle all these stinking ghouls? We can, but only the way I say we can. I don't want to hear any more of your crap, Hammer. Hammer didn't have time to answer. There were shrill cries from the marketplace, and several women ran in that direction, drawing our attention to the commotion. Even the mourners stopped screaming and craned their necks to see what had happened. Sergeant Axe ordered 2 soldiers to see what was the matter. They rushed into the marketplace with rifles drawn and disappeared into the crowd of women running in all directions. In the midst of the commotion, I noticed a small black figure, a coffin, leap to its feet, duck under the platform on which the deceased lay, and disappear into the nearest hut. Sergeant Axe and Hammer noticed it too. As it came to him. The sergeant commanded. With a swiftness unexpected in such a full man, Hammer rushed through the circle of mourners and stopped at the entrance to the hut, with his rifle prudently pointed at the door. Seeing me standing behind him, he stepped inside. I followed him in. After the sun-drenched, bustling marketplace, the hut was dark and very quiet. The earthen floor was covered with straw mats, and a small wooden table and 2 chairs made up the furnishings. Instantly looking around the hut, Hammer said, "They must have gotten under the thatched wall." He jumped out the door and ran around the hut. When I caught up with him, he pointed to the field adjoining the villa. There he is. A small, dark figure, less than 30 meters away, was running across the cultivated green field. We'll never catch him, I said, but Hammer had no intention of pursuing him. He raised his rifle and fired. The little figure fell into the grass and was out of sight. I've got the bastard, Hammer exclaimed. We moved cautiously in the direction from which the moaning had been heard. A boy of about 14 was lying on his back, clasping his bloody shoulder with his hand. His little black eyes stared at us in horror. He tried to sit up, but Hammer stepped with his boot on his chest and pinned him to the ground. You little brat, you couldn't fool me with that funeral cloak. Say your stupid prayers, Charlie. You won't have to kill any more of my friends. The boy closed his eyes. What do you want to do? I asked. Us, crush his fucking head. But he's unarmed. He didn't shoot at us. He's just a kid. The sergeant said to hold everyone for questioning. I don't give a shit about the sergeant. He didn't believe me when I told him the bastard wasn't a woman. But he's just a kid. He tried to run away. Why? It's the goddamn Viet Cong. Let the lieutenant decide that. What the hell's the matter with you? I don't want to kill the kid. He can't hurt us. He's wounded. And if he's Viet Cong, they want to question him. He can give us information. Hammer, whose fleshy face exuded sweat, seemed stunned by my outburst. I've seen guys like that shoot a rifle. The bitch who killed my friend wasn't much older than this jink. The boy twitched in pain and tried to free himself from Hammer's boot. Don't move, you bastard. Hammer shrieked, pressed harder on the boy's chest and moved the boot higher on his bloody shoulder. The boy groaned, his dark eyes looking up at me pleadingly. I saw a look of wild terror on his face, like that boy on the riverbank. Blood was oozing from his mouth. You're going to strangle him, I shouted. Let him go. I glared at Hammer and held back my anger. The sergeant was about to come in, It won't do him much good if you shoot the boy. He's going by the book. I've had to go out with him before. That's it, Hammer said sternly. So you've been singing along? Yes, I said, feeling the strength of my position, and clicked the safety of my rifle. I'm acting by the book too. Sweat trickled down Hammer's face, but he managed to squeeze out a smile. Good. He took his foot off the boy's shoulder. Aye, aye. I'll keep an eye on him. Go get the sergeant. I'll wait for you. I didn't trust him and continued to stand there, hoping that the sergeant or one of the soldiers would show up. However, there was no one in sight. Finally, I said, Okay, I'll be back as soon as possible. Calm down. I'm always calm, Hammer replied. He followed me as I ran into the village, turning around every now and then. Hammer stood with his rifle in his bent hand, wiping his face with his sleeve. When I reached the hut at the edge of the field, I turned around once more. Hammer made a sign to me to hurry. I rounded the corner of the shack where he couldn't see me, knelt down, pressed myself tightly against the wall, and peered out into the field. I was sure Hammer couldn't see me. My body tensed like a steel bar. Hammer poked the boy with his rifle. I waited and watched. The boy struggled to get to his feet, still clutching his shoulder, and, pushed by Hammer, stumbled and walked away from the village. I didn't understand a thing. Why the hell was Hammer taking him away? This was in direct contradiction to the instructions we had been given. I rose from my knees to stop Hammer when suddenly he fired a shot. The shot at such close range threw the boy several feet forward into the grass. Hammer stood motionless, looking toward the village. I froze against the wall of the hut. Disturbed female voices came from far away, but it was not clear whether they were lamentations for the dead or alarms caused by the gunshot. I kept my eyes on Hammer. He lowered his rifle and lit a cigarette. Then he walked to the spot where the boy had fallen and stopped waiting, still smoking. The field in the rays of the morning sun was quiet and serene. Hammer's figure stood out sharply against the sky. It was only now that I realized that no one had been working in the field. There were no other witnesses but me. I was annoyed at myself for missing the moment again, and I was chained to the wall of the cabin. I was roused from my stupor by the sight of Hammer, lazily smoking a cigarette. My hatred for him grew like the taste of bile in my mouth. I snapped out of my seat and ran to the market. Pushing my way through the crowd of women who had once again surrounded the vegetable stalls, I looked for the soldiers of my patrol, but they were nowhere to be found. At the far end of the market square, I stopped to look around and noticed a group of women looking at me anxiously. "Where are the Americans?" I shouted. They looked at me in confused silence. "Does anyone in this damn country understand English?" I was furious at my helplessness. How the hell do you talk to your allies? How do you help them if they don't understand you? I looked into the frightened faces of these ordinary women. Some of them could have been the mother of the boy killed in the field. Alone in this marketplace, I felt like the victim of some ridiculous nightmare where death mocks the absurdity of life. Suddenly I came back to reality. One of the women raised her hand and pointed to a hut at the end of the market square. Nodding my thanks, I turned and walked toward the hut. I hesitated at the entrance, remembering Hammer's warning about never entering the hut alone. From inside I heard a familiar soldier's voice. "Let's get the hell out of here." And a corporal appeared on the doorstep. "Where have you been?" he asked, coming out of the hut. "Where's the sergeant?" Out. I heard some chatter in Vietnamese and Sergeant Axie's voice. Yes. The sergeant came out of the hut, followed by 2 other soldiers. "What's wrong, Glass?" the sergeant asked. "Did you catch him?" We heard a shot. I nodded, gathering my thoughts. What happened here? Nothing much. One of the old women in the market had some kind of seizure, lost consciousness, and all the women howled. She's in there. I can't understand anything in their Gukova language. She must have been affected by the heat. He wiped his forehead as if to confirm his words. What was that shooting? Hey, the boy was running across the field. He was already far away when Hammer fired and wounded him in the shoulder. I didn't want to answer more of what I was asked in front of the others. I didn't know them. I wanted to tell the sergeant everything when we were alone. Hammer doesn't know what I saw. I have to be careful, but this time I won't keep quiet. I made that decision as I watched the frightened faces of the women in the marketplace. Life wasn't ridiculous and death wasn't abstract. Where's Edge-Ma? Hey, guarding the boy. He doesn't look more than 14. I've come for you. All right, said Sergeant Axe, let's go. On the way, Sergeant Axe expressed concern about the situation. He suspected that there was a connection between the fainting woman in the marketplace and the boy's attempted escape. It smelled of an elaborate plan. He speculated that the boy might have been a Viet Cong protected by the peasants, at least some of them. The corporal and the two soldiers readily agreed with him. Why would the boy run away, risking his life, if he was innocent? I could have given several reasons, but I didn't give them. They might be right, but I needed more evidence and less speculation. Even if the boy was Viet Cong, that didn't justify Hammer killing him. I couldn't see it as anything other than premeditated murder. Hammer, standing in the same spot where I'd last seen him, waved at us. "Where's the gook?" Sergeant Axe asked me. Probably lying in the grass. I wonder how he'll react when he finds the boy dead. It didn't take long for the answer to come. Seeing the dead boy lying at Hammer's feet with his eyes and mouth open, Axe turned to me. I thought he was only wounded in the shoulder. When I went to get you, he was alive. What happened, Hammer? The bastard tried to run away. I had to shoot him. You're saying he was shot in the shoulder and tried to run while you were standing over him? Yes. His legs were intact, Sergeant. I had my rifle on my shoulder and was smoking a cigarette. Suddenly, I saw him running through the grass. Since when do you guard a gook with a rifle on your belt? I guess I wasn't thinking. What's the big deal? Just another dead gook. Hey, you were supposed to keep him alive for questioning. We don't even know if he's Viet Cong. He doesn't look more than 13 years old. Hey, he's old enough, Sergeant. These kids know how to handle a rifle. I've dealt with kids younger than him. Yeah, but he didn't have a rifle, did he? He didn't. Too bad. It would have made your case easier. What case? You saw him trying to run away. You said, go get him. Turn him over. The corporal knelt down and turned the body upside down. There was a bullet hole in the back of his head, just below the hairline. Clean work, Hammer, the sergeant said. So the gook was wading through the grass? Yes, but he hadn't gone very far, about 10 meters, when I took the rifle off my shoulder and fired. One shot, huh? That's all I needed. When I shot him in the shoulder, he'd gone about 30 meters into the field, and that boy's not much of a target. Hammer was obviously pleased with himself. I was the most accurate marksman in the whole battalion. Especially at 10 meters, maybe less, huh? Hammer didn't say anything. The sergeant looked at all of us. Let's go back to the village and continue the inspection. I'm sure the peasants are watching us right now, and when they find that gook, it's unlikely we'll be much good to them. Do you understand? If this guy's clean, they might raise a scandal. He looked at Hammer. I just hope he's not the son of some village elder. Nonsense, Sergeant, Hammer said. I'm a simple soldier, not a politician. I'm required to kill gooks, aren't I? You're required to follow orders. Your stupid story is lame. There isn't an American soldier in Vietnam who'd believe this kid tried to run away with a hole in his shoulder. Are you saying I'm lying? I'm saying you're a shit, and if I had one witness, I'd punish you severely. Hammer was stunned. I don't understand this stupid war. I'm doing my job, killing gooks like I was taught, and now you're telling me I'm wrong. You killed a wounded boy and ruined the whole thing. Maybe you've turned the whole village against us. I don't know. I hope not. Now let's get out of here. We can't stay here. What about that guck woman who sat next to Charlie at the funeral? Hammer asked anxiously. Did you find her? Maybe she knows something. Yeah, I've been thinking about that. We'll have to find out. On the way back, all I could think about was how to tell Sergeant Axe that he had this one witness. I didn't know when I'd get the chance, but I hoped. Hammer watched me with suspicion, but I gave no indication that he had anything to worry about. Secretly, I felt a great relief. If Sergeant Axe was willing to administer punishment, he was my man. Although the funeral ceremony was still going on, there were no mourners at the woman's coffin, and the chances of finding her in the village were slim. None of us could identify her with certainty, and in a village with many elderly Vietnamese women who looked almost identical to us, our search seemed more than futile. The language barrier hampered our attempts to learn anything, and if any of the locals understood English, in his zeal, Hammer looked into the face of almost every woman in the market, some of whom he tried to question rudely. But each time the woman looked at him with confusion and fear and remained silent. An underlying hostility toward us became evident, and more women left the market and returned to their huts. Finally, Sergeant Axe ordered the search to cease. Our presence alarmed the residents, creating a tense atmosphere in the usually busy market. But we had orders, and Sergeant Axe was not a man who would leave them unfulfilled. If the search of the marketplace led nowhere, perhaps a search of the huts would prove more fruitful. We began it, going from hut to hut. But no weapons were found in the huts, nor was there any particular anxiety on the part of their inhabitants. At least, nothing could be read on the faces of the old men and women but resignation to our uninvited presence. They bore the search of their houses in silence. If they hid anything from us, we found nothing. They were impenetrably calm, knowing that they would stay here in their homes and work their fields again after we left with our planes, tanks and guns. But they will remember us long after we have forgotten them. We were a cruel reality in their world. They were a nightmare in our world, a nightmare that lasts 365 days, and when it's over, we'll go home and go on with our lives as if nothing had happened. By mid-afternoon, we had searched more than half the huts, but found nothing. None of the residents complained of any disturbance from the Viet Cong. On the contrary, when we mentioned Viet Cong, the only word they understood, they shrugged their shoulders and shook their heads. Some women who knew a few English words answered more definitively, repeating like an automaton, "The Viet Cong are not here." It seemed pointless to me to continue the search. We had stirred up the whole village. But Sergeant Axe patiently and persistently demanded to check all the huts in the village. As there were still a few hours of daylight left, he was not going to stop his work, no matter how tedious and disgusting it might be. He hated to invade huts and disturb people, but he had to do it. An order is an order, and it must be obeyed. It was 4 o'clock when we left the last hut and took a smoke break. We were more tired than if we had been in battle. In addition to the exhausting heat, we were exhausted from fruitless attempts to make contact with the villagers. The corporal was disappointed that we found nothing, but the sergeant was satisfied with the operation. We had conducted the search in good faith, and he was convinced that the villagers were not intimidated by the Viet Cong, or we would have found some signs. Although no one had mentioned the boy's murder since we left the field, some underlying nervousness was felt among us. During the search, Hammer seemed preoccupied, and now and then glanced warily at the sergeant and me. It was clear that the sergeant's stern response to his story had alarmed him, but he carefully avoided further conversation about it. I felt that he did not know how to deal with me. If he had any suspicion that I had seen it all, he concealed it skillfully. I noticed, however, that he was fidgeting about me, and if I said anything to the sergeant he would be sure to hear, he was sweating profusely. And I knew it was not only from the heat, and though I secretly rejoiced at his restlessness, it frightened me. I'd already learned a great deal, and I knew that men like Hammer would do anything to save themselves. Like hungry wolves, they would eat their own. In my own way, I was prepared to do the same when the time came. Before returning to the base, we walked around the market square one last time. There were no longer any sellers or buyers. The vegetable stalls were empty. The stalls had closed. The funeral procession with the deceased had gone to the burial place, leaving behind flickering and smouldering candles. There was nothing else to do here, and we went to the base along the road that ran along the edge of the field, skirting the village. We had not gone a few meters when we saw 2 village elders coming toward us from the field. They were walking slowly, with difficulty, bent under the weight of the load they were carrying. It was a dead boy. The old men bowed their heads and breathed heavily. Only when they came close to us did they raise their heads and look at our faces in silence. As they passed by, I nodded my head sorrowfully to them. I think, but it's worth questioning them, Hammer said. Maybe they know something about Charlie. Maybe they wish to question us, replied the sergeant. Do you want to answer their questions? I was only doing my damn job. Yes, only I don't think they'd understand it, even if you knew the Guk language. It's just 2 old men carrying home a dead boy. They're used to it, Sergeant. There's a lot of dead Guks in this country and a lot of dead American soldiers. Oh, don't lecture me, Hammer. I did my share of killing Guks. That's why I got these patches. Then what are you criticizing me for? Because you blew the mission. What did you want me to do? Let that Guk escape? Then I wanted you to take him prisoner. That's why we're here, to capture the suspicious. If you can't guard a 14-year-old boy with a bullet in his shoulder, you're not fit for the job. He'd have gotten far if I hadn't hit him with the first shot. You want another badge for good shooting? God damn it, I don't understand you. Then shut up and move. Let's go. I was very encouraged by the sergeant's attitude, and all the way back to the base I just waited for the moment when I could tell him everything I knew. I intended to answer the question I read on the faces of the two old men. Why didn't you tell me earlier before I reported to the lieutenant? Sergeant Axe asked, giving me a reproachful look. It was 8 o'clock in the evening, and we had been talking in the mess tent for more than half an hour. The other members of the patrol had already eaten and left. The sergeant came in later, and I lingered over a cup of coffee to be alone with him. Hammer lingered to see what the sergeant had said to Lieutenant Axe, gave him a bit of a hard time before admitting that he had reported his version of the murder. As for Hammer, that was the end of the patrol log for the previous day. Now I opened it again. I couldn't talk in front of Hammer. I had to tell you alone. That's what I thought when I saw the hole in the boy's head. The shot came from 3, maybe 4 feet away, but I had no proof that the boy didn't run. It was a lie, but I had no proof. Now you do. I'm your witness. It's not that simple. Why not? Hey, I already gave the Lieutenant Hammer's version, only I tweaked it. Why would you do that? Hey, I couldn't corroborate his implausible story, and I couldn't demand punishment without the facts. I support my soldiers, regardless of personal suspicions. You can't run a successful operation by hitting your own soldiers if you don't have the facts. It undermines morale, and you're left with a bunch of slackers, each of whom only cares about themselves. But you said yourself that Hammer blew the mission, and now you have the facts to prove it. There's nothing I can do, Glass. How can I go back to the lieutenant after I've made my case for Hammer? Hey, tell him the truth. Tell him you just heard it from me. I'm willing to go with you if you want me to. He'll ask why you didn't tell him right away. It won't look good. My report's already in the record. Hey, we can fix the damn report. I told you I didn't want to talk in front of Hammer. I'll tell the lieutenant again. Oh, it'll put me in a stupid position. After all, I had lied to the lieutenant about how the boy was killed so that Hammer's actions would make sense. Now I'm angry. What did you tell the lieutenant? Matt Hammer killed the boy with the first shot as he ran into the field. But there were 2 shots. The lieutenant doesn't know that. But the whole patrol does. No. So what? No. So what if the lieutenant finds out there were 2 shots? How would he know? He's got no reason to ask questions. And who's going to tell him otherwise? I was impressed. You protected Hammer better than he would have done on his own. He had no choice. I did. I don't understand. I told you I couldn't nail Hammer without proof. He grinned. You should have saved the patrol. You were saving your own skin because Hammer didn't follow your orders. The sergeant's face darkened. Enough. I have nothing more to say. No, you don't. I'm going to the lieutenant. Keep your head down, boy. They'll cut it off. God damn it. You said it yourself, if only there was a witness. I thought that's what you wanted. Yeah, I did. But now it's too late. It's not too late for me. Are you trying to make me look like a liar? Hey, I'm not trying to make you look like anything. I just want to tell you what I saw, that's all. The lieutenant's going to call us all on the carpet. What you say will contradict what we say. Nobody saw anything but me. What about Hammer? He killed the boy, and I put in my report how he did it. Hammer will back me up, and so will the others. Trust me. You're out of your mind. Yeah, I'm out of my mind. I said what I said because there was nothing else to say, and I'm not going to change my report now. And no one is going to shit on me. Is that a threat, Sergeant? It's a law of life. His voice softened. I would have punished Hammer severely if you had told me sooner. You know that. But this is different now. It won't do anyone any good if we change the report, but it'll make us look bad. It's a lousy situation, and I'm as disgusted as you are. I know guys like Hammer. They lived. I don't consider it exemplary military service, and I don't like that they go unpunished. But I'm not going to ruin my army career for them. I'm not just doing my time, I'm staying in the army forever. I got a good record and everybody knows I'm a good guy. I can't let a scumbag like Hammer ruin my career. I'll bet my head he won't play such a mean trick on me again. I suddenly felt sorry for him, and I thought he was strong. I never would have believed he'd be Hammer's accomplice. But that didn't bother me anymore. What bothered me was that he was making me an accessory too, and I resisted. I can't keep my mouth shut, Sergeant. You want me to make a fuss over some gook kid who might as well have been Viet Cong? It doesn't matter if he was Viet Cong. What matters is that we lost the opportunity to find out who he was. If we don't stop guys like Hammer from killing just for the fun of it, we're as guilty of murder as he is. Nonsense. Hammer is guilty because he acted against orders. Yes, I said tiredly, it was against orders. I have nothing to say about it. An army is built on following orders. That's it. Do your job and forget about everything else. I smiled sourly. Yes, I'm always being told to forget it. Trouble is, I have a good memory. I'm telling you to forget today, Glass. Go to bed. It'll look different in the morning. If that boy will be dead in the morning, you could be dead too. You gonna bury me, Sergeant? Not today, Glass, the sergeant grinned. But the Charlies can fire missiles at the base any time. They're up in the hills, watching all the time. I know. I wasn't smiling. And then there's old Hammer. I won't tell you what he might do if he finds out you talked to the lieutenant. Yeah, I thought about that. But I could kill him first. They won't skin me for that, said the sergeant, still smiling. I got up from the table. I'm going to bed, Sergeant. I'll keep you posted. Go on, Glass, and think about what I said. The war ain't over tomorrow. How long you got left? I don't know. And how do I know, Sergeant? And I left the mess hall, leaving him to think about the case. I spent the night smoking pot, and in the morning I went to see the lieutenant. When I finished my story, the lieutenant leaned back in his chair and stared at me in silence. I fidgeted restlessly in my chair, waiting for any reaction. It's good of you to come to me, Glass, the lieutenant said at last. The company commander can't do his job well without knowing what's happening to his soldiers in the field. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded my head. Are you sure no one but you saw Hammer kill the boy? Yes, sir. Didn't any of the farmers see? Was anyone in the field at the time? No, sir. There was no one in the field except Hammer and the boy. Now, did anyone hear the second shot? No, I don't know, sir. They might have heard it in the village, but the villagers are so used to gunfire that no one pays any attention to it. No, so no one left the village at that time. No, sir. Not while I was hiding behind the hut, anyway. But I didn't stay there long. I went to look for the sergeant. Perhaps then someone might have seen Hammer in the field. I don't know. He was there until I came back with the patrol. And then you all stayed there for a while? Yes, sir, until we got back to the village and started searching the huts. Was anyone at the funeral disturbed by the boy's absence? I didn't linger near them. I wanted to find the patrol as soon as possible. Yes, but the funeral ceremony was still going on? Yes, sir. And the market was open? Yes, sir. So if they heard gunshots, they weren't too alarmed? I don't think so. Murtazing 4. How long do you think Hammer waited for you to return with your patrol? About 10 minutes, maybe 15. And how long did you stay in the field and talk before you went back to the village? Another 10 minutes. And you didn't notice any peasants watching you during that time? No, sir. These questions increased my embarrassment. I didn't expect to be cross-examined like a witness in a court of law. I could sense where he was going, and I didn't like it. Are you saying the peasants can't say for sure who killed the boy? No, I wouldn't say that. They're pretty clear about it now. Why do you think so? Hey, they saw the boy run away and Hammer, and I went after him. And they must have heard the first shot. We were standing at the cabin, about 15 feet from the funeral. That's good, but they couldn't have known if the bullet hit the target or where you fired, could they? They didn't know then, but of course they realized later when they found the boy and brought him back to the village. But they couldn't say for sure who did it, could they? Mercer, I'm telling you Hammer did it. That's why I'm here. Yes, Glass, but at the moment I'm interested in what the villagers know. I understand, sir. But can you tell me what you're going to do? It would save time. Lieutenant Cauldron looked at me angrily, but suddenly agreed. Yes, I suppose you're right, Glass. He smiled strained. You and I are on the same side, aren't we? Yes, sir. I need detailed information, Glass. I have a difficult task. I realize how I look to you, but I answer to battalion headquarters, and they'll want facts. I've given you all the facts, sir. There are little details that may seem irrelevant at first glance, but they're not. They may develop into something much bigger than you realize. Oh, sir. If this boy is not Viet Cong and the peasants realize we killed him, they may show up here very soon and complain to base command. We don't want to quarrel with them. We want their friendship. My job is to make a strong case for us. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest. I don't see what arguments can be made in our favor, sir. Why not, if no one but you saw it? No. So you don't intend to report my message to battalion headquarters? I don't think that's necessary, Glass. I don't think you realize the problem we're facing. I think I do, sir. No, you don't. What's done is done. We can't give the boy his life back. I'd like to keep him alive. We could find out why he ran away. But now it's important to maintain good relations with the peasants. That is my task. I told your patrol he had a delicate mission, and now Hammer's foolishness has made it more difficult, and I'm glad I've learned the facts from you. Forgive me, sir, but the peasants now know that the boy was shot in the shoulder and killed by a shot to the back of the head. They'll understand what happened, of course. They're not stupid. Yes, Maine. Yes, but I didn't know there were 2 shots until you came to me. The peasants had more facts than I did. He shook his head. Sergeant Axe should have told me the truth. I realize he was covering for his soldiers, and I can't condemn him for that. But he should have been smart. He was in the neighborhood. He knows how the chain of command works. I would have defended him, but I had to know the facts. Thank you, Glass. Do you understand me? But I'm not here to cover this case, sir. No, don't think about it, Glass. I'll arrange it, but I hope there won't be any more surprises. No, sir. I've told you everything. Good. What about Hammer? If he finds out I've been to your place, he won't like it. Signed, Lieutenant, Smile. I wonder when you came up with that. Don't worry, I'll take care of Hammer and Sergeant Axe. He'll be in trouble too. I understand, sir, but I want you to know that I came here knowing that I would be hunted later. You did the right thing. I'll keep you safe. I hated myself for turning the conversation around to keep myself safe. I'd thought it over at night and decided to tell the truth, and now I felt unclean and my conscience rebelled against it. Oh, I can take care of myself, Lieutenant, I muttered. Yes, but I have to take care of the morale of my soldiers. It's part of my duties. Stay away from Hammer. I'll make sure you don't go on patrol with him. That's fine with me, sir. I don't want this conversation to go beyond this tent, Glass. Do you understand? I don't want it to reach battalion headquarters. I'll take care of it myself. Yes, sir. Glass. Yes, sir. Don't grieve for that boy. I know how you feel. I'm disgusted, too. But these things happen in war. It's important not to be influenced by them. I'll keep that in mind. I'll keep that in mind. One more thing. Did Hammer cut off the boy's ears? No, sir. He wasn't touched after he died. That's good. If he had his ears cut off, it would have looked really bad. The Viet Cong don't do that. I met the lieutenant's gaze calmly. That's it, Glass. Yes, sir. As I walked out of the commander's tent, I squinted against the bright morning sun. I was disgusted with myself. I'd been tricked. The lieutenant had made me an accessory to the murder I had come to expose. If I went over his head to battalion headquarters, my life would not be worth a dime. On an army base, especially in a war zone, it's hard to keep anything secret. News leaks from the higher-ups to the lower downs. So the day after my conversation with the lieutenant, I heard from the soldiers about a meeting between the village elders and the platoon commander. They had come to protest the killing of a child of one of them by an American patrol. Lieutenant Cauldron was asked to give a report on the patrol's actions. He presented his arguments, and since the villagers did not provide concrete evidence, headquarters absolved itself of any responsibility for what had happened. The battalion commander attributed the blame for the tragedy to Viet Cong elements operating in the valley and assured the village elders that it was the job of the American patrols to protect the villagers from such atrocities. That was the end of the incident for the army, but I couldn't rest and went to see the lieutenant again in the evening. What else, Glass? I got right to the point. Sir, I request permission to report our conversation directly to battalion headquarters. A strained smile ran across the lieutenant's face and disappeared immediately. And that won't be necessary, Glass. I need it, sir. Are you still feeling guilty about that gook you killed? Yes, sir. Therefore you wish to go over my head. With your permission, sir? Don't mess with my head, Glass. If I don't authorize it, you'll still go to Colonel Cannon, won't you? Yes, sir. I'm surprised at you, Glass. Do you really think I'm that stupid? I don't think you're stupid, sir. Well, you're absolutely right about that. You're not going to tell Colonel Cannon anything new because I've told him everything. Everything? It's the chain of command. Each instance reinforces the next, and so it goes all the way to the top. Fortunately, the peasants didn't see Hammer kill the boy, so everything went smoothly. The incident is over. Understand that? Yes, sir. I understand it now. Very good. I have no remorse for not transferring you out of here with Thomas and the other unreliable soldiers from that patrol in the gully. His remark surprised me, and he saw it in my face. You knew Thomas had shot Doll, didn't you? The whole patrol knew it. But you kept quiet then, didn't you? I didn't see it. Yeah, but you didn't care that Doll was killed. Did you think he deserved it? No, sir, I didn't. Do you want to tell me about it? No, sir. That incident is over too. Isn't it, sir? Yes, it is, Glass. Now get the hell out of here and keep your mouth shut. I don't want to hear any more of your complaints. You won't, sir. The next day I was assigned to night patrol. When we assembled at sunset for a briefing in the patrol leader's tent, I was surprised and alarmed to see Hammer there. My anxiety was increased when he greeted me in a friendly manner, as if he were glad to see an old friend, which of course I was not. Did he know I was at the lieutenant's? I couldn't hear the patrol chief very well during the briefing. My thoughts were preoccupied with Hammer. I couldn't believe that we had been put together by accident. Lieutenant Cauldron always looked very carefully at the patrol assignment lists in his platoon. I glanced at Hammer surreptitiously, trying to catch any sign of his changed attitude toward me, but in vain. He listened quietly to the patrol leader and seemed not to notice my interest in him. He was a cunning beast, and I should have been even more cunning. At that time, the main task of our four-man night patrols was to protect the base from enemy infiltration, who made short strikes to undermine our warehouses and generally disturbed us constantly. Our patrols were well armed, rifles, grenades, knives, and had enough firepower to destroy anything they encountered or heard in the dark. What was particularly unnerving was that it was often impossible to distinguish the enemy from our night ambushes hunting the Viet Cong in the valley. And there were instances where we killed our own soldiers in the dark. In most cases, the only warning sign was a sound, the stomping of feet in the bushes or the crack of a dry branch, and sometimes the scream of a man being stabbed. The threat of an unexpected ambush was constantly hanging over us, and this caused a terrible tension that demanded the utmost concentration. We could not be distracted for a second. A sound that could not be heard could be the last sound of a lifetime. That evening we crawled under the wire, and in the fading light of day crept through the minefield surrounding our base. If you don't get out before total darkness, you risk getting blown up by your own mine. For the same reason, night patrols should not return until dawn, when it was light enough to see their way back through the minefield and to be seen by the guard. In addition, the enemy had more experience in night fighting, and this put us at an even greater disadvantage. The Viet Cong had the initiative throughout the area. They acted, we countered. Because of this and the higher casualty rate on our side, night patrolling was considered among American soldiers the most troublesome combat mission. After passing the wire fence and minefield, we ducked down and then slowly moved toward the rocky hills about 200 meters from the front of the base. We reached them without incident and settled down to listen and watch during the night. From it, we could see the descent into the valley, from where the enemy could appear. Besides, it was wide, flat, and devoid of shrubbery, so that it was impossible to approach it unobserved closer than 30 meters. We sat down in a semicircle, the patrol leader and Hammer beside us, and the other soldier and I with our backs to each other, watching the left and right slopes of the hill. About half an hour everyone was silent, getting used to the sounds of the night. The rustling of leaves, the cry of a bird, and the incessant buzzing of mosquitoes that found us in the dark. We waved our hands in silence toward them away from our faces. When Hammer slapped himself on the neck, we all tensed. Stop it, the patrol leader hissed. They'll eat me alive, Hammer complained. Let them. You want Charlie to kill you alive? No, kill me alive. Well said, Sergeant. Knock it off. The inactivity of a night patrol was more nerve-wracking than a firefight. We sat in silence for hour after hour, in constant tension, trying to distinguish the sounds coming from a man from the natural sounds of the night. We couldn't smoke or move to stretch our stiff legs. After a while, waiting and listening begin to get on your nerves, and you start to shudder even at the flapping of a bird's wings in the darkness or the rustling of grass. The night seems endless, and one almost wishes that an enemy would appear just to relieve the tension of the night vigil. But the night passed without incident, and as dawn broke we were overcome with a great sense of relief. We waited until it was light enough to see the road clearly and made preparations to return to base. Down in the valley below, the mist was dissipating and the first rays of sunlight illuminated the fields of elephant grass. We broke away from this beautiful sight to start on our way back, when Look. The sergeant turned sharply around in a circle. What's the matter? There. Hammer pointed to the edge of the forest. 2 Viet Cong dressed in black and armed with automatic rifles were walking slowly along the edge of the field parallel to the edge of the forest. While we watched in silence, Hammer raised his rifle and took aim. Stop, said the sergeant. They're out of range. You'll only scare them off. Hammer lowered the rifle. They'll get away anyway. They might, unless they're not coming at us but away from us. But they're heading south, away from the base. Look at that, Hammer. They're coming to the end of the path that leads down from the south end of the base. Maybe they're setting up an ambush on the path. That's where the day patrols go. Then we have to destroy them, Hammer said impatiently. No, wait. We'll report their location. Let the day patrols deal with them. Look, what the hell are they doing? Another soldier exclaimed. Looks like they're eating, I said. That's right, Hammer agreed. Those knuckleheads are sitting down to breakfast like a picnic. Maybe they don't know there's a war going on. Yes, they do. They're not hunting buffalo with battle rifles. Listen, Sergeant. If we go down the trail fast enough, we might catch the bastards with their mouths full of rice. We must report their whereabouts, the sergeant insisted. Of course we do. In the meantime, 2 of us could go down after them. All right, I agree. It would be a good idea to take them prisoner. Do you know the road, Hammer? I do. I've been down it a few times. No. How about you, Glass? I shook my head, but Hammer said, We used to go on patrol together. I'll show him the way. All right, you 2 go on down, but stay together. I'll watch from here. He turned to the other soldier. Lawton, rush to camp, tell the lieutenant where the gooks are, and run back. I may need you. Yes, Sergeant? Mamma hung his rifle on his shoulder. Let's go, Glass. Just a minute, Sarge said. If I spot any other gooks, I'll give 2 short bursts over the trees beyond the trail so you know it's me. That will mean the gooks are in the majority, and then get out of here now. I don't want you to be ambushed. If I'm not here, I'm going back to base to call for a chopper. You should give night patrols a walkie-talkie for this kind of thing. Don't worry about us, Sergeant, Hammer said and grinned. I'll bring you a bowl of rice for your souvenir collection. Come on. I don't have any souvenirs like that yet. Now get going. Gooks don't eat for long. We left the sergeant sitting hunched on the hill and went deeper to the right into the forest. I knew this path well. It was the path we had followed into the hollow on the morning of my first patrol, but I had not told Hammer about it. I wanted him to lead the way because I didn't trust him. He really wanted me to go with him. I hoped the sergeant would disagree with Hammer's plan and leave it to the day patrols. But he was determined not to miss the opportunity to capture 2 Viet Cong in the open, especially since there was an eager hunter like Hammer. What could I say? That I was more concerned about my partner than the enemy. So I found myself in a desperate position, alone with Hammer, hunting for the enemy, but feeling that the man who was leading me into the valley was hunting for me. I wasn't sure of my suspicions. You often exaggerate danger in Vietnam, but I realized that caution wouldn't hurt. Halfway down the trail, we stopped for a break, loaded with heavy gear. Packs, body armor, grenade belts. It was difficult to walk straight through the woods, and even on the open sections of the path that sloped steeply downhill, our upper bodies were so overweight that it was hard to keep a firm step. Hammer had an extra burden, his fat, and he was paying for it with sweat that stung his eyes and streamed down his face so that he had to wipe it off now and then to see where to go. Every extra movement drained him of his strength. He was breathing like a St. Bernard in heat. "Aren't you sweating, Glass?" he asked and popped a few salty pills into his mouth, taking a big gulp of water from the flask. "Of course I am." I wiped my face to convince him. "You skinny bastards are happy. You eat like pigs and don't gain an ounce of weight. Everything I eat turns to fat." "I can't help it. That's just the way you are. Besides, you're a smaller target. You ever think about that?" "No, it never occurred to me." "Well, it should. He's got a sly grin. Take Charlie. When you get him in your sights, it seems like there's nothing to shoot at. I must look like an elephant to him." "I never thought of that." "It's true. The odds are evened out. Huck can't see that well with his slanted eyes, and I can knock a bull's testicles out at 200 yards. I did that once. You should have seen the cattle jump." He laughed at that memory, and I smiled back. "I guess we'd better get moving, or those buggers will be gone." Hammer loosened the straps of his pack. "Hey, I should have left that stuff with the sergeant. We don't need it. Why don't we take off our grenade belts and packs and hide them here? We might need the grenades. I'm not going to get close enough to fire them. I'm good for a couple shots. Grenade belts aren't that heavy, but they make you feel safer. Just in case, you know. What if the Charlies find them if they come through here? I don't want to get blown up by my own grenade." "Yeah, I guess you're right." Hammer took off his satchel and threw it away from the path. "Let the gooks eat my lousy rations." He expected me to do the same, so to please him, I threw my pack down too. I didn't want him to think I could carry a bigger load. When we started up again, I lagged behind, letting him go ahead. But the path was wide enough to walk beside him, and Hammer waved to me, inviting me to catch up with him. "What's the matter?" I asked, approaching. "Let's make a plan before we get to the bottom." "What do you suggest?" "Just before the end, about 700 meters from here, the path splits. We can get there in about 10 minutes. I'll go left, you go right, toward the edge of the forest. If the gooks are still munching, we'll just kill them. And if they pass my position before I get there, you can intercept them. But maybe we'll get lucky and they'll be right between us. Then I'll fire left and you fire right, and they'll be caught in the crossfire before they realize where they're shooting from. Agreed?" Although Hammer's plan made sense, I didn't like the suggestion of splitting up. I objected. "The sergeant told us to stick together." "Nonsense, Glass. We're 2 by 2. If they stay together and we split up, it will mislead them. They'll think they're surrounded and we'll have the advantage of surprise. What if they split up and cover both lanes? Then we'd have a 1-to-1 ratio. But the gooks aren't expecting us. They'll be watching the path and we'll be under cover of the trees. Either way, we'll succeed." I still felt uneasy, but my arguments were exhausted. "All right," I finally agreed. We stopped talking and quickened our pace. When we reached the fork, we stopped to look around before we separated. The field below was peeking through the trees. It looked so serene in the rising sunlight that it was hard to believe it could be the scene of a gun battle. "I don't think they're through yet," Hammer said. "Well, good luck, Glass." He grinned and strode into the thicket of trees to the left. I stood frozen at the fork. I hoped the Viet Cong had finished their breakfast and were long gone, so I wouldn't have to kill. I was ill-equipped for the alien world around me and would not be able to do anything about it. I was shaking with fear and indignation. My anger was directed at Lieutenant Cauldron. I was sure he was determined to get rid of me. It was quite some time before I finally stepped off the path and into the woods along the right-hand path. After walking about 40 meters through the undergrowth, I reached the edge of the woods bordering the field, took a position in the shade of the trees, from which I had a good view of the field and the entrance to the right branch of the path, and waited. As yet nothing was visible. I raised my rifle and, looking through the scope, slowly guided the barrel across the field. This narrowed the field of view and allowed me to see details better. In the scope, the field was sharply divided into distinct patches of grass, wavering and diverging in the warm breeze.